the fall lecture series. I'd like to remind you that tonight, after the lecture, immediately following, will be a reception, tonight sponsored by the Associated Students of Historic Preservation, who've done a wonderful job out there. And it would be nice to head over there as well to look at the exhibit that just went up. This is from the AIA Indianapolis Awards in Excellence. So please stay after the lecture for a brief moment and enjoy some talk and some food. Now I'd like to introduce Jim Glass, the Director of the Historic Preservation Program, to introduce our speaker tonight.
Welcome, good evening. Happy on behalf of the College of Architecture and Planning to see such a large group here tonight. And we are pleased and honored to have with us this evening one of the Midwest's leading preservation architects, that is T. Gunny Harboe, who is director of the preservation group practice of McClear, which is a design and construction management firm in Chicago, Illinois. Gunny derives his respected reputation within the preservation architectural fields from his careful and sensitive direction of the rehabilitation of the Rookery and Reliance buildings in Chicago, two of the most celebrated office building designs in the Chicago School of Architecture. Both were designed by the inventive and imaginative architect John Wellborn Root, and both represented important steps towards the modern 20th century office building that depends on steel skeletons rather than masonry or wood for structural support. Gunny's firm was awarded the contracts to design the rehabilitation of these two national historic landmark buildings, which had both deteriorated through decades of neglect in the Chicago Loop. Gunny was the architect in charge of the projects, and he and his colleagues solved the challenge of making both buildings useful and desirable office spaces in the 90s while retaining the arresting qualities that the original designers had given them. Gunny Harboe came to these projects with a versatile professional background. He holds a Master of Architecture degree from MIT, including study at the Danish Royal Academy of Architecture in Copenhagen, a Master of Science in Historic Preservation degree from Columbia University, I might say parenthetically, he's one of our competitors, and a Bachelor of Arts degree in History from Brown University. He has worked as a restoration carpenter at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and we saw some of the restored rooms that he helped assemble this afternoon in slides he showed us earlier. And since 1988, he served as director of the preservation group at McClear in Chicago, where he is responsible for all kinds of projects involving preservation, restoration, or rehabilitation of buildings of historical architectural significance. Gunny and his team set a very high standard of quality in their design and construction supervision of the Rookery and Reliance building projects. The Rookery won a National Honor Award from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and both an Honor Award and an Interior Award of Excellence from the American Institute of Architects. The Reliance Building Rehabilitation won the 25th Anniversary Award of the Landmarks Preservation Council of Illinois and a Special Recognition Award from AIA Chicago. Gunny was also kind enough during the Reliance Building Rehabilitation to give our Ball State preservation students a tour of the building during its hard hat period, in which we got to see the before state of the building, and he even allowed each of us to take home a genuine piece of John Wellborn Root terracotta, such as this piece here, which I hold in my hand, and we thank you for that, Gunny. Made quite a hit. We are very pleased to have you here and look forward to hearing about Chicago on the Re-Rise, restoring 19th century landmark skyscrapers. Ladies and gentlemen, Gunny Harboe.
Am I on now? Can you hear me all in the back? The few that are up there? Okay. Well, thank you for having me here this evening. And we have a lot of ground to cover and not so much time. These are two projects. The Rookery took about 3.5 years. The Reliance building was about 2 years, although the construction period was only 11 months, a very quick turnaround on a project like that, which you'll see. And I'm sure there'll be some things that I leave out in the course of the discussion just because of the matter of time and not being able to pack it all in. But I'll try to cover the salient points as best I can and some of the sort of interesting side stories that crop up in the course of a major restoration project like either one of these. And of course, if you want to stay after at the reception and ask questions, feel free to do so. So without further ado, get the lights. Let's see how we can do this here now. Well, most of you know Chicago. You're not so far away. Hopefully all of you have been there. It's a city that's renowned for its architecture, particularly its skyscrapers. We like to think of it as being the birthplace of the skyscraper. New York sometimes gives us a little problem with that, but nonetheless it is synonymous with the development of modern architecture as we know it today. And the building on your right is one of the early Chicago school buildings. It's the Fine Arts Building by S.S. Beeman of 1885. And there are some similarities with how this building was designed originally and with the Rookery, which you'll see in a moment. I just want to show you a few Chicago school buildings to sort of put this in context here. This is the auditorium, which I'm sure you all know, by Sullivan. And this is Burnham and Root's Monadnock building of the late 1880s. Let's see, the Manhattan building by Jenny, the old Colony building, Halliburton Roche, I believe. If I get them confused, you'll have to excuse me. I always claim I'm not an architectural historian, but you have the books and they can give you all the proper dates. But these are the kinds of buildings that we're talking about in Chicago, setting the stage for what was to become known as the Chicago School. The Fisher Building, which followed right after the Reliance Building and has a lot of similarities to it. And of course, again, Louis Sullivan, the Carson Peary Scott Building. Now, the Rookery was originally designed in 1885. Burnham and Root were the architects. Here you have an original document, the drawing of the elevation, and a photograph from when it was completed in 1888. It was built as a speculative office building. The primary investors were the Brooks Brothers of Boston. They supposedly never saw the building completed. There was quite a connection. There was quite a cadre of individuals involved. Edward Waller, who was involved in the next phase of this project as well, was involved, and he was good friends with Burnham and Root. They were very well connected in the city. You all know about the fire, I'm sure, and what happened after that, so I'm not going to talk about the rise of the skyscraper. But at any rate, these two were instrumental in that whole period of what was to come amongst their brethren architects and in the development community. Now, this Brooks Brothers thought that there should be some wonderful Indian name for this new building that they were going to spend all this money on. And they had all different kinds of ideas. And in the correspondence back and forth, it proved that Burnham and Root felt very strongly it should keep the name the Rookery. The site actually was known as the Rookery prior to the fire. It was well, there's several stories, but this was the seamy side of town with gambling saloons and houses of prostitution and so on. And when the fire came, it swept all that nastiness away. And there was an iron water tower on the site that was the only place for quite a while around that pigeons could roost. So that had connotations both as being this seedy part of town and then the pigeons, and it was also the site of temporary city hall. And if you know what a rookery is, it's a place where crows or rooks live, and it's a very noisy affair where they squawk and make all kinds of noise. So there was this connotation of these blusterous politicians and the squawking crows being somewhat similar. Nevertheless, the Brooks Brothers prevailed, and the building's official name became the Central Safety Deposit Vault Company Building. Not very exciting. But Root had the last say because he immortalized it by carving the laughing rook into the impost of the arch. And it was always known as the Rookery before and after the building was designed. Here's Burnham and Root in their 11th floor office. I'll show this briefly after the Rookery part. We also restored this room. This is Burnham, and this is Root, and this is Venus. The design was revolutionary in some ways. It was a very large building. It was purported to be the largest building of its day. I hate those greatest, biggest, largest, best because they're always surpassed, and there's always one somewhere that you don't know about. But anyway, it was a very large building for its day, and as you can see here, it filled basically a good piece of, well, it fills this whole block. This is kind of a small city block, but nonetheless, they were allowed to build this out all the way, and it gave them this unique sort of square donut design that allowed for a double-loaded corridor, as you see here. And that meant that every office got natural light and ventilation, which of course was at a premium in this day, and they took great advantage of it. You can also see here illustrated the floating footing grill. This is a railroad steel that is used as reinforcing, and then concrete poured over it, which made for like a floating footing on the bad soil condition of Chicago. And this was one of the first buildings to use this method, which became commonplace for the next 15 years or so, or yeah, about that, until they started using caissons. What this meant, though, is by building the square donut, not only could they get the natural light and ventilation, but they also could do something quite spectacular down at the bottom of this. And here you see the section, the shaft, the light well, and the light court, and then here's a blow up, and here's the area that we're going to be talking about primarily here tonight. The restoration was, well, the building was built or bought by Continental Bank in the mid-1880s, and they were in this building right next door, and they were intending to rehab it and take it over as a single user. Unfortunately, they got into financial difficulties and had to sell the building, and they sold it to a young U.S. Treasury bonds futures trader. That's always a lot. It's almost as long as the Central Safety Deposit Vault Company, named Tom Baldwin. He was 35 years old at the time, and he had several extra $1 million in his pocket because he'd been doing very well trading. And he bought this building, not really, I think, knowing what he had in store for himself. And the exterior had been cleaned, and there had been some repairs to the parapet above, but otherwise nothing had been done. And we were hired to come in and to rethink kind of what had been proposed before. And he wanted to make this the #1 restoration project in the country of an office building like this. No one had attempted to do anything to the level that he wanted to do it, and to turn the office space itself into Class A space. This had been B- space prior to that, and Class A space was what was selling up and down the street, and he knew he had to compete with that. The 190 South LaSalle building by Philip Johnson was brand new, across kitty corner across the street, and that was what he was competing with. So here's the building, fully restored. The outside had been cleaned, and one of the things we started with was dealing with the outside. And you can see here, this is prior to any work being done. This storefront had been changed many times, and they had these very thin, sort of wimpy little mullions here, and we wanted to reconstruct those. So using this historic photograph and some fragments from above, which we left intact, we carried those down through and then reconfigured the storefront to simulate what was there. We didn't have any actual fragments of this, and we know it was a little bit different. We made this out of cast aluminum, so in the future they'll be able to tell what's new and what's old. And there it is finished. We also had to do something with the windows, as you always do, and we had a very successful situation here where we had these large sash, very heavy sash with a very thick stock that had been used, which meant that we were able to install, we removed all the sash and routed them out and installed a double glazing, which you see here, and put the original sash back in their opening. So this meant that even though the glass was new, that at least the wood sash were the original sash. And these, of course, were fixed in place because the new mechanical system that's in there is a closed system, as in any typical new office building, which meant that we had to seal the building up. And there it is restored. You can also see some of the wonderful terracotta. Again, I'm not going to go into all the details, but the building was sort of a hybrid structure. It had a masonry bearing facade on the four walls, and then in the interior walls were, or the interior of the building was all carried on a metal frame, cast iron and wrought iron. It was not, there was no steel in this building at all, even though the home insurance building across the street was using steel. So they kind of were at that sort of awkward period of not really deciding what kind of structural system they were going to use. The main entrance here, you see, is prior to the restoration, had a double revolving door. This is the configuration left by William Drummond's remodeling of 1930. I'll get to that in a second again. And we reconfigured this, opened up this upper light here, and moved one revolving door to the middle. This gave us ADA access right here through the front of the building. This was before that was mandatory, but nonetheless the owner felt, and we also agreed, of course, that this was a very good thing to be able to let people with disabilities in right through the front door. Now we enter into the inside, and inside the building had also undergone a number of changes. Here you see the original design of the front LaSalle Street lobby, this beautiful two-story space, sort of an elongated octagon designed by John Welborn Root. And this has this nice marble staircase. And here you have Frank Lloyd Wright's remodeling of 1905 to 7. And people often ask, why did Wright do this? And I guess the answer is because he was asked to. We don't really know why. There is not good documentation on, or correspondence on why this happened. It was very much of an anomaly for Wright. It's a remodeling, number one, which he wasn't known for doing, and it was a commercial project, which he wasn't known for doing. This was done at the time that the Dana House was done, the Unity Temple was on the boards, and a number of his other very important houses. So it's a very important period in Wright's work, but sort of an oddball project. And there's very little of it was published originally. There's this photograph and one of the grills, which you'll see in a minute, and otherwise not much. So it wasn't something that he was sort of pushing. He wasn't really looking to get a lot more of this kind of work, I don't think. But you can see he basically inserted this staircase into, he left the floor alone, he left this elongated octagon alone. Here you see the incising patterns, which we'll see in a minute and talk about more. And he picked up on that and ran with it, so to speak. Then in 1930, William Drummond desecrated it. He won a competition to do this, so it wasn't his idea, it was someone else's idea, but he carried it out. And William Drummond had actually worked for Wright at the time that this work was done. We don't know that he worked on it, but he may have worked on it. Basically, he obliterated the two-story lobby at LaSalle and on Adams Street, floored it over, allowed for more banking space on the second floor, but you can see they blocked up this beautiful window that had painted glass on it. So of course we had to tear all that out and go back down to the structure. Here's the structure coming out. And that's how the room looks today. 100% reconstructed. So how did we do that? Well, we had these photographs, which were obviously very important. We also had the good fortune of having Burnham and Root's original construction documents. And here you see their design for the stair. One thing, whenever you get one piece of information, you always have to make sure you check other things. If you notice here, it says iron railing, bronze finish. Well, if you saw that photograph, you noticed that was marble. So they don't always, just like today, they change their minds as they're into the course of the project. They did the same thing here. They put this railing in the other lobby. Oops. And here we had Frank Lloyd Wright's marble shop drawings, and these were key. These were found rolled up in the basement and were invaluable to us because they had the dimensions of every piece of stone. So when we had big pieces of stone like here and on the ceiling underneath, and the contractor was saying, we can't do that, that's too big. We said, well, why not? They did that in 1905. You mean you guys can't do what they did back then? You've got better technology today. So they had to acquiesce and do what we asked them to. But they couldn't give us the marble we wanted. So we had the terrible duty of having to go to Italy. Oh. I'm out of sequence here. Had to go to Italy to match. Here's a piece of the original stone we took with us. And it was really the only, I don't know how many submittals we got, but we just couldn't get it right. So the owner said, okay, we're going. And the contractor, this is one of the contractor's representatives, myself and one of the owner's reps, went. And we actually went to Carrara and picked out 5 blocks of stone. The Italians thought we were nuts. They were laughing at us, but I think we got 4 out of the 5 that we picked. There's one I think they slipped us at the end that wasn't the one we picked, but nonetheless it was very close in the veining, as you can see, which was what we really were going for, especially when we were trying to blend things in the old part of the building. Now, while we were picking marble and so on, we were also working on the incising patterns, as I mentioned, and I understand there's an Owen Jones expert in the audience, so I have to be careful what I say. This is Owen Jones's grammar of ornament, and we believe that most of the ornament in the original rookery was derivative of Owen Jones. Owen Jones was an Englishman who did this fabulous book of all these different patterns from all over the world, and they were very popular in the 19th century for architects to lift from, and they did quite freely. In the case of the rookery, the only one that we were able to identify as being an exact match is this pattern here and this pattern here, which, in fact, this is Frank Lloyd Wright's work. So whether or not one of his draftsmen got lazy, or we don't really know what the story on that is, but we do know that it matches from that book. There are 22 different patterns in the building, and some of which had disappeared. We had to use photographs to help recreate them. We used the CAD system to help make variations on the sizes and so on. It got very complicated very quickly. But nonetheless, once we had established the full-scale pattern, we gave it to the incising guy. The stone was all fabricated in Italy, shipped here, and then incised in Chicago. And here you can see we transferred the full-scale drawings onto that Borco, that vinyl that you use on drafting tables, and they adhered that to the stone. Then they carved it out by hand, put it in and sandblasted it lightly to give the relief in the stone. But that gave you a very different texture than the original carved texture of the stone, of the incising. So they had to go over the whole thing by hand with a pneumatic chisel in order to give it that tooled effect that we were looking for. Once the stone was incised, then it was erected. Here they are putting up on site. And once it was on site, they gilded it. And the process for the gilding, I can barely see this perhaps. This is pink here. There's a ground that was painted on the stone on the incised area first. And then this darker yellow is called size, and that is like a sticky varnish-like material. And when that gets to the right tacky quality, then they would apply the gold leaf, which is very thin sheets of gold, 23-karat gold. And then they would burnish it with a little brush. And that's what's on there. And this is the finished product. As an aside, there was one fragment of this stone buried in a wall, and this is a unique pattern. This is the only place in the building that this exists, so that had a whole little story to its own, but fortunately we found it and were able to lay it out knowing exactly how big the piece was. The mosaic floor was a little bit of a similar story. We had this one fragment. Fortunately, I took this photograph because the next day the demo guys threw this in the dumpster, and that was the only piece of the floor that we had. And so we had that, and we had dimensions from the drawings and so on, so we were able to work backward from that. And you can see here we didn't have as much success on matching the color of the stone, although we tried and we tried and we tried. This is as close as they said they could come, so eventually we had to go with it. Now we're moving in towards the light court. This is the William Drummond elevator lobby. This is how it looked in 1930 when he was done. Originally these were open cages. When it was done in 1930, they came up to the current fire code. They had to enclose it all. And this is how it looks today. It's virtually the same. The only difference is the floor. He had replaced the entire mosaic floor with Tennessee marble, and we went back with just a plain yellow field of mosaic here so that it sort of blended in. Here's a wonderful detail. And he kept the rookery theme, although he got a little more literal. There's bats and some birds and so on that are carved in here. And Annette Byrne, who was the wife of Barry Byrne, another famous architect, actually did the graphic layouts for this. Now on to the light court. The light court's sort of the main event in the building. If any of you have been there, it's very dramatic when you enter that space. It's gorgeous, and it's actually a very intimate space. It's not as expansive as it sometimes looks in these photographs. This is the original Burnham and Root design, and you can see these wonderful electroliers, the mosaic floor, and the very fanciful and sort of typical ornament that was going on for all of Root's work. The skylight here, someone was asking me before about the gold leaf. There is gold leaf highlights along here. It's kind of difficult to see, but they are there. Frank Lloyd Wright came in again 1905 to 7, and he basically just reclad materials using the same theme, the white marble with the gold leaf, and of course he added these very signature Frank Lloyd Wright fixtures, and of course the urns with the ferns. 1930, when Drummond destroyed the two-story entrance lobbies, he had to have another access path, so he designed this stair. There was supposed to be one here that never got built. Maybe it was a cost-cutting measure. That's probably what it was. But this actually was a little fortuitous because it saved a fragment here, which I'll show in a minute. But you can basically see that he left the skylight open, but he closed up a lot of these walls here. We don't really know why he did that, but that's what he did. And then this is how it looked when we started. It had been tarred over, 30 coats of paint on the skylight. All this wonderful metalwork had been painted, and here it is restored. The skylight, as I mentioned, had been tarred over. We believe in the 50s that there was a story about it being for the blackout for the war, but I really don't think they thought the Nazis were going to air attack Chicago. Maybe they did, but that was a bit far for them to get. But nonetheless, it caused us a problem. I think it had to do with the fact that there's 5,000 pieces of glass with 4 corners in them. It always leaked. There's 20,000 corners for water to get in, and it did. And they just got tired of dealing with it, so they tarred it over. And the only way we could deal with it was to actually sacrifice the glass. We left the glass in when we sandblasted the underside to get the 30 coats of paint off, which meant we lost the glass, so we had to spend a lot of time finding a replacement for the glass, which we eventually did. And there it is restored. That's one of my favorite pictures. And in order to do that, we had to, of course, put a sprinkler system in to protect this lower area for fire code. And so that's one reason we added the skylight at the top. It was also to just protect all these historic elements, the light well, the skylight, the light court below. And it also put lessened the load of the mechanical system on the building. Now we're not heating and cooling these outside walls anymore. The Adams Street lobby is a little bit of a similar story. Here's Wright's design drawing. It wasn't very accurate. Here's the original photograph. And here it is today. The urn they supposedly made 3 times. I still don't believe that today, but they said that they shipped it 3 times, but I don't think they did. Here you have the original grill from the Frank Lloyd Wright elevators. They were replaced on the 1st and 2nd floors. And they were back in this corner. I'll show you in a second. And we had the good fortune of finding one in the basement that was buried between 2 other doors. So we knew exactly what he had there. This is now in the artifacts collection at the Art Institute. You can go over there and see it. But there were also a number of them that they had used for rebar when they were doing some remodeling. And that's what this is. We dug those up. When the demo guys found that, they called me up and said, "You got to come see this. You won't believe it." And there they were. There were about half a dozen of them stuck in the floor. None of them obviously in good shape as this, but we salvaged all of them. And the intent was that we would reconstruct this elevator wall, but even Mr. Baldwin had limits on how much money he could have, so we haven't ever done that. That was about $500,000 worth of metalwork that he wasn't willing to pay for. So it's very unfortunate because what you have there is this was to be a backdrop for that to sort of emulate the light shaft, because it was open cages, there was light cascading down there, and that's what this was. But right now that's all it's there, so it's kind of you always have disappointments even in fabulous projects, and that was probably one of the biggest ones right there. They could still do it, and hopefully someday it will, but right now it doesn't seem like it's going to happen. This is the Oriole stair. It had 20 coats of black paint. And it had this marvelous cast iron of copper plating on it that's very subtle, very beautiful, and it gives you a sense of what that original Burnham and Root space was like prior to Wright's remodeling. And here it is, the spiraling upwards. It's quite a great sight when you get up on the 3rd floor and look up that. You almost fall over. Again, I just wanted to mention a little bit about the corner here. known as the interpretive corner. This is how it was when you took that piece of the stair out. There was this fragment here, and this column cover was left here. So we decided to, actually had to push really hard to do this because there was opposition from one person. They thought this would ruin the balance of the room. Anyway, we left the column open. We restored this fragment so you could see the original mosaic floor. And in this corner here, there's also been a panel design, which they still haven't installed. And here you have Burnham and Root, Frank Lloyd Wright, William Drummond, all in one corner, so to speak. As I mentioned, they had their offices on the 11th floor. And as sort of a secondary project, this is the library space. This is their office. This is the original room. And that's what it looked like when we started. The same thing on the other side. Here's the fireplace where they were sitting. There's Venus. And now on to the Reliance building. Same architects, at least in the beginning, and this is William Hale. And William Hale made his fortune in elevators, the Hale elevator. Almost all of the Chicago school skyscrapers used Hale elevators, hydraulic-powered elevators. And he had been a partner in the Rookery and many other projects. This was the first one he was doing solo, and he called on his favorite architects to design his new building. On the site, there was a building, the First National Bank of Chicago, which actually survived the fire. Here it is, and they rehabbed it. And there was a very interesting lease structure where the tenants on the upper 3 floors had a lease till 1895 or 94, and the one on the first floor was up in 91, and Hale didn't want to wait, so they jacked the building up. They demolished the first floor, excavated underneath here, put the steel in for 15-story office building, and all the while these guys were still working up here, which they were not happy about at all. It was smelly. They did a lot of it in the wintertime, so they had these, those salamanders, those heating units were going all winter, and that was very nasty, which I guess the Hale didn't care because he wanted all these guys to get out of there anyway. In the meantime, in 1891, unfortunately, at the young age of 41, John Root died. And it was definitely a sad day in Chicago. And for this man, Burnham, he was crushed that he had lost his partner and his friend and his design genius, and was really kind of adrift. This is Charles Atwood, who came in to fill that role. He wasn't while he was a good architect, he was not the great architect that Root was, but he certainly helped Burnham through the times that he needed, and Atwood was key during the Columbian Exposition, of course, in designing several buildings. The Museum of Science and Industry was the main one. Here's the building going up. The steel was erected in less than 30 days, which was supposedly a record in its time, and they had a unique column structure, the gray column, which you'll see in a second a detail of. But at any rate, they were going 2 floors on sort of every other column, which gave them some lateral stability. And then by the table leg principle, these are big girts that are riveted together, so there's no cross bracing in the building. Here's the building complete in November. Everything except here, this is painted in because I don't think they quite had it finished. The building underwent a number of changes, and when we got involved in it, the first phase of our project was to do a historic structures report, which is a full-blown study of the building, and that involved doing a lot of research on the documentation. We found many, many photographs that allowed us to date different changes to the building. Here you see the mullions had been changed here, which was important for us, and the storefront had been left alone, and I won't go into all that detail, but there were a lot of interesting stories that were told by just studying these photographs intently. And it underwent some other real nasty remodelings. Here, in 1940, they tore the bottoms of the bays off here and here so they could install these beautiful big signs. And you can see they're beginning to take the cornice off here. This was, think about 1948. And this is how it looked to most of us, remember this, scalped with the Carroll sign, sort of standing there very sad, dirty, dark, and suffering greatly. Here it is in horrid color. And the big question was, well, how bad is it? And it sat here and no one could do anything with it. There's a very complicated ownership situation that went back to the original building when Hale was building and he got in trouble on the cash side, and he sold the lot to his buddy. I can't remember what it was. I don't know whether it was Fisher or somebody. Anyway, he sold the lot to one of his developer friends and then bought back a 200-year lease, and that gave him enough cash to finish the building. So and then there was someone who owned, there were 3 different ownership claims. So the city decided, okay, enough is enough. They had this debacle on Block 37. I don't know if any of you know that story, but anyway, they had to do something with this building. And they took it by eminent domain. They paid off the different owners' claims, and they set upon to restore it. And it had to be approved by city council. It was a real interesting political situation. And as I said, we did this study, and the study was intent on finding out, well, how bad is the terracotta? It was pretty bad. There was a lot of vertical cracks, which meant there was compressive forces. And there were a lot of lintels that had problems. You can see the crack here, and here's what it looked like inside. But the good news was that the backup steel was all really pretty good. In fact, there was only one location, 2 locations where we had to replace a shelf angle, and those had already been replaced once way back when. So the backup steel was good. That was the good news. The bad news was that a lot of terracotta was bad. In fact, there were 2,000 bad pieces. One of the first things we had to do was clean the building. You see that here. And of course, that had to go on at night because of the chemicals, and this is on a very prominent, busy corner. So we had to go out there at 2 in the morning to make sure they were doing what they were supposed to be doing, the way they were specified to do it. This shows the complexity of the terracotta system, or maybe I should say the simplicity of it. The complexity of our problem was the simplicity of their way they had done this. Here's the terracotta. Here's a cast iron member. And this thing is just strapped on here with one little, actually I have in a bag over here if anyone wants to see it. I have a fragment of both of this and of the anchor so you can see out. But basically just hung back here. Here it is. Here's the anchor. And here's the cast iron. It just goes and hooks behind there and it's just sitting there. So when you have a couple of these that are bad, they're stacked on top of each other. You got to pull more out than you would otherwise like to. Here's the gray column, which allowed them to run piping up through the hollow part of the column. It's made up of built-up angles. So we found that by pulling one piece out, sometimes several around it would pop. And this was because of the compressive forces in the facade. The only way to relieve that, with Jenny Elsner, I should mention, our facade consultant, was very imaginative in figuring this out. And they decided that if we cut in here at every head joint along the facade, we could here's the tool that they were using. Right here, we could cut into that and break these forces. And that proved to be very true. So they went from the very top all the way down, working around at each level and relieved these forces and allowed us to then pull pieces out as we needed to in order to replace them. And here you see the backup, the condition of the backup. And here it is being painted. Everywhere we open something up, we, of course, clean off the steel or the steel and the cast iron, and then we painted it with an epoxy paint so that we won't have any problem, and then we used stainless steel, of course, in reinstalling them. Meanwhile, we had to be making terracotta. We had to make 2,000 new pieces, and we had some problems in getting them to do exact matches, so we spent several visits out doing quality control checks and so on. Here we are trying to make the color match, which took about 12 different versions before we finally found something that matched. And here it is, sort of ripped open with many of the pieces out. And you can see it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle with many of the pieces missing. Not only we replaced 2,000, but there was another 1,000 that had to come out and go back in. And we tried to save as many as we could, wherever possible. Unless a piece was structurally unsound, we reused it. Here we are soaking pieces. Some of these are original, some of these are new. I love the little kiddie pools that they were using. Very imaginative. And then it was just installed just as you would today, or the way that they did it. And just, here's the mason putting it in. Here's the new stainless steel anchor. Here's this is a not so pretty one, but this is a patch that they were doing. They did come back and cut this so there was a joint here. This is a patching compound, and then that was painted out with a paint just to blend in with the terracotta. And so these cosmetic repairs were just done in that way, and we did several hundred of those. That meant that we could leave the original fabric in the building. Another major piece was the cornice. You can see that had been removed as I showed. This, we had very sketchy documentation. We had this photograph, which was pretty good. It showed you the patterns up here and the square pattern and so on. And we had this very sketchy drawing. By the way, I did say Atwood did design the shaft of the building, but he was following Root's lead. We don't know what Root designed for the shaft, but we know the Gothic pattern, or the Gothic ornamentation, was Root's idea, because the first floor storefront, which did survive, had the same pattern. And here you have a bit of it here in a reflected ceiling plane on the cornice. And they were using the same moldings and ornaments. So we took a pattern off of this. Here they are. They took this is a rubber mold, and then they blew it up to enlarge it to fit the size, because we had the drawing that showed how big this was. And they made a pattern out of wood. And then this is the aluminum casting. Now, we used aluminum instead of terracotta for several reasons. One was cost. Another was maintenance, because the overhang, the way that the terracotta was installed and so on, it had failed originally because it wasn't maintained well enough, and it failed. The aluminum was much easier to take care of in that way. And also the Secretary of Interior Standards, which is the credo, if you will, which restoration architects follow, says that if its piece is totally missing, you're allowed to replace it with another material, a substitute material, as long as it looks like the original. And we felt we could come very close to matching the way that it looked using this material. There's the panel, and you can see how easy it goes up. One man can, there's another guy on the roof, but basically two men can install these panels. And because it was a discrete architectural element, there's a sealant joint here. It separates them. It's very easy to separate them, so there's no problem with differential movement and so on of materials like you would have if you were trying to put a piece of that sort of in the middle here. And one of the little quirky things that went backwards, didn't it? We had to find a way to put davits in, the window washer davits. So in this ornament here, we put a hole, and then there's one of these flowers that go in here, and then this is the plug here. And they all thought I was crazy, and I probably was, because of course the maintenance guys never stick the plugs back in the holes. But anyway, they're there if they so choose. And all this work is going on with a fixed price, because it was a design-build project. I didn't mention that, but my company does design-build work. This was a design-build project, which means we were at risk for the contract as well as designing it. And we had an 11-month schedule because the mayor wanted it open for Christmas season. And we had to tear the sidewalk out. And all the work wanted to be done in about a 2-foot deep and 200-foot high work zone. So it was really a scheduling nightmare. But nonetheless, we were able to do it. Here you can see this. I don't know how well you can see, but this is rotted all the way through here, or rusted through. So all that steel had to be replaced. That threw us out about a month out of our schedule. The windows, big controversy. What to do with the windows? Unfortunately, we didn't have the wonderful thick, heavy wood sash that we had at the Rookery. We had very thin. It was, this meeting rail is 1 1/8 inch deep, which is nothing. And we had a really hard time finding any window manufacturer that would give us an insulated glass unit that they would guarantee on a high-rise building with the profile that we had. And we kept hammering them, and they said no, and we kept pushing, and no, and no. And finally, they did agree to do it, but they're fixed. And again, this was to be an office building, and this may become an issue. I don't know now if it's going to be converted into a hotel, which is what the word on the street is, what they're going to do about these fixed windows, because they will not be able to replicate the look of these in a movable sash. You can see these are the original windows. Many of them had been, the plate glass windows had been replaced with 2 smaller pieces. These mullions were added. The elevator wasn't big enough to take a full sheet of glass up. So this was their cheap way of doing it, instead of getting a crane out every time they had to replace a piece. I'm sorry, I have the There's the condition of them. And here's the, this is the new window, which matches, trust me, it matches exactly. The big plate glass windows were a real problem because they were just held in place by a half-inch rabbet in the cast iron. This is a cast iron. I don't know how well you can read this. This is about as big as I've ever seen them. But this is a cast iron member exposed to the outside, and it's just sitting there. That's just the glass sitting there. And when we put in insulated glass, by the way, insulated glass was required by both by the city and the developer because any office building worth its salt today has to have insulated glass. And so we had a very thin profile aluminum sash frame built for this and an insulated glass unit installed. And we had a lot of problem with getting flat glass because the original was polished plate glass, which no one makes anymore. And there was a lot of back and forth about how are we going to do this? How are we going to fix this? And then went backwards again, didn't it? We ended up going with the best thing that glass technology allows today, which is just annealed float glass. That's all you can get. And there was a lot of discussion. See the roll, the distortion here, the wavy lines, wavy gravy. And that's both because the glass is not as flat, plus the double glazing gives you this reflection that you wouldn't otherwise get. And here you see this is when you have this, the reflection's actually not so bad, but this is the original glass. We left two bays here. This is original glass, all these here, original sash that were restored, and this is kind of the interpretive corner, if you will, on the facade that shows what the original was, so you can still see it. Just quickly go through this last. Here's the bay that had to be replaced. Here it is torn out. There it is sort of ripped out. We had this one so we could make an exact replica of the bronze bottom and the mullions and so on. The storefront is a temporary solution. The city didn't want to pay the extra $1 million that it was going to take to do the granite and bronze, beautiful bronze filigree work and so on that was from the original. There were fragments from over in this area that were saved, so we can do a faithful reconstruction of that. But that has to wait for the next phase. Here's the summary. Here's the building in this original postcard of 1895. This is what it looked like before we started. There's Humpty Dumpty all torn apart. And there it is as it stands today. And that's it. And I guess the epilogue is that we're still waiting. There was a proposal out in March from the city to redevelop the inside of the building, rehabilitate it. There were two proposals. We were teamed with a developer that was going to keep it as an office building. The other proposal is to turn it into a hotel, which if any of you are reading the press these days know that's the hot thing right now, is to turn old buildings into hotels. And that's what we think they're going to do to it. And I'm very disappointed because I felt that this building is sort of the quintessential office building. It was originally built as doctors' offices, and many of the partitions and corridors and so on remain. Now they may be saving that. I don't know how they're going to do that with all the code issues that they have to face to turn it into a hotel. Hopefully they will. But it would have been a nice case of not adaptive reuse, but of continued use. And we have to wait to see what's going to happen. But the word on the street, even though the city hasn't officially announced it, is that that's how it's going to go. So we'll have to see. And that's it. I welcome any questions you might have. It's all perfectly clear? I think we actually finished on time. Yes?
How do you make a decision about repairing a piece of terracotta and painting it? That paint is going to wear out?
Yeah, the paint will have to be... the problem with this building was they never maintained it. And they know that whatever they do, they're going to have to maintain this building. And that's another reason why those davits had to be installed, so that they can actually get a swing stage up to where they can touch the building. Because even though we replaced 2,000 pieces, the likelihood is that they will have to be replacing pieces occasionally for the rest of its life. And the patching is, as you say, it will have to be painted. The windows are wood, they'll have to be painted. The cast iron will have to be painted. So there is, and the sealant joints will have to be renewed. Excuse me, the mortar should be good for, I don't know, 20 years, but that'll have to be maintained. So there's, there will be constant maintenance basically on this building, as there is with any building. I don't know, I don't know how often you get to Indianapolis and how old the buildings are there, but one thing is very clear in Chicago. There's scaffolding on buildings all over the place. Part of this new law they have about facade inspections. Any building over 6 stories has to be inspected, and if it needs work, it has to be done. But also on these big buildings, the Time Life building, which was built in the 25 years ago, they've reclad that thing, or parts of it, twice already. Of course, it's Cortan steel, maybe that's why, but nonetheless, they're always fooling around with that, and it's true on many other high-rises. These curtain walls on these newer buildings are just as maintenance-prone as an old terracotta building. So they should get some good life and service out of this, but they have to keep an eye on it. And the painting, that's an issue. We tried to do it in a way that was least intrusive and would be easy to fix again. That's really was the thinking on that. Okay. Yes?
It's already made bids for the restoration of the interior. One bid for hotel, one bid for
There were 2 proposals. The city had a request for proposals, and they only got 2 back that were real. One was for an office building, and one was for a hotel. I think the city is pushing for the hotel myself, but I don't know that. Nobody knows yet because they haven't announced it. They sent a floater and cranes last week. It's been, rumored for some time that this is how it's going to go, but there are code issues about how are they going to get the tax credits because the parts of the interiors are still there, and the State Historic Preservation Officer, Mike Jackson for Illinois, is very clear about his opinions on the inside of this thing and that he wants them kept because they're unique. And how they're going to be able to fulfill the fire marshal's requirements for a hotel and save the interiors, including there's a wonderful small but wonderful metal open staircase that runs the top 7 stories there that's still intact. How are they going to keep all that? I don't know. I don't know what I haven't seen their plans. It's all very hush-hush. I mean, it's been literally since March. We haven't heard anything officially. No. I think, people are, right now it's a $6.4 million sculpture on State Street, so everyone's hoping that something's going to happen, and because hotel is the big buzzword now, that I don't think they're going to get a lot of resistance. Well, I agree. I mean, I agree, especially when we felt we had a very reasonable proposal. And I don't know what, it really comes down to money, I guess, and I don't know how much money they were asking for. I'm sure they were asking for some money, additional funding from the city along with the building, because it just doesn't make sense financially to do it any other way, but maybe they could make it work, I don't know. Very anxious to find out, but they haven't, like I say, this trial balloon was in cranes. It said that it looked like it was going to be a hotel, but it isn't official yet. I'm just worried because there's so many people think they're building hotels now in the city. Somebody's going to lose, just like they did on the office glut. There's going to be a hotel glut, but hopefully it won't be this one if it goes that way. Yeah?
I gather from the photographs that in the rookery, the original lobby, when they put the second floor in, most of the Frank Lloyd Wright renovation was obliterated. Is that?
I'm sorry, say that again?
When they remodeled the last time in the lobby of the rookery and put the second floor in.
Yeah. Yes, the LaSalle Street lobby and the Adams Street lobby were completely gone. Those are both 100% reconstruction. Maybe I wasn't clear about that.
Well, I was wondering, what were the arguments like? Were there some people pushing that, well, the Frank Lloyd Wright material's gone, let's go back?
What do you go back to? Well, that's a good question. I should have delved into that a little bit. But basically, there's so much Wright fabric that's intact in the light court that Wright is such an important architect, and there's good documentation for the Wright period and not as good documentation for the Burnham and Root period. I mean, if you're going to go Burnham and Root, then you sort of have to go the whole way with Burnham and Root and take that Wright stuff out of the light court and go back to Burnham and Root. But not only was it be much more expensive, but you're throwing out all that historic fabric, which you want to leave in place, of course. And the terracotta column covers and a lot of that stuff didn't exist, so you'd be speculating on what was that. It's always better to go with your, to use the word conservative, more conservator's approach, and leave as much stuff as you can in place, which meant the Wright theme was kind of the dominant theme. And that's why the lobbies were reconstructed at that period. Now, we left the Drummond entrances alone for two reasons. One, they wanted to have, and the Drummond elevator lobby, they wanted to have some part of Drummond's work left and recognized. It was also cheaper to do that. And we didn't have good documentation for the entrances during the Wright period, or there might have been an argument for doing that. No matter what we did, it's a 1992 building. It's not Burnham and Root, it's not Frank Lloyd Wright, it's not William Drummond, it's 1992. And we tried to be, as upfront about that as we could, and yet do it in a unify the design in a way that sort of brought out the best of those periods. It's a difficult one, and hopefully we did it well. I don't know. I think most people feel we did it well, realizing that it's very complicated. My only concern is that people get confused when they're looking in there. What are they seeing? Which is why in that interpretive corner, there's supposed to be a large panel with these photographs and text to explain to people, because people come in off the street there and they don't know what they're seeing. So it is confusing, but it's a complicated story. Oh, come on, there must be more questions than that.
Final question?
You can ask me over a cup of cider outside if you have a question. Okay? That's it. Thank you.